My name is Ava Bennett. I was 25 years old the night my mother called me a failure in front of my father's boss. She said it with complete confidence, the same confidence she had used for years whenever she told people I never amounted to much. What she didn't know was that his boss already knew exactly who I was, and within a few minutes, the entire room would be staring at her. The story started a week before my father's retirement dinner. I was sitting in my office reviewing contracts when my phone buzzed. The message was from my sister Rachel. "Dad's retirement party is Saturday at 7. Mom expects you to be there." A few seconds later, another message arrived. "And please don't make things awkward." I stared at the screen and laughed, not because it was funny, because it was predictable. In my family, I was always the one expected to apologize before anything had even happened. Rachel was the successful daughter. I was the daughter who supposedly couldn't get her life together. At least, that was the story my parents had been telling for years. Whenever relatives asked about me, my mother would smile politely and say, "Ava is still trying to find herself." It didn't matter that I had been running a business for 5 years. It didn't matter that I owned property. It didn't matter that I employed people. None of those facts fit the version of me my family preferred, so they ignored them. 5 years earlier, when I was 20, I left college to start a logistics company. My father thought I was making the biggest mistake of my life. My mother was embarrassed. The night I told them, Dad pushed his chair back from the kitchen table and said something I never forgot. "Most people build a future by getting an education." I remember looking at him and saying, "And what if there's another way?" He shook his head. "That's what people say before they fail." My mother agreed with him. For months afterward, every family gathering felt like an intervention. Every conversation ended with someone asking when I was going back to school. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain myself. Not because I gave up, because I got tired of defending a dream nobody wanted to understand. So I worked. While everyone else talked, I worked. When my friends were sleeping, I was answering emails. When people were on vacation, I was making deliveries. Slowly, things started improving. The company grew. Then it grew again. A year became 2, 2 became 5. And somewhere along the way, I stopped caring whether anyone believed in me, especially my family. The strange thing was that my parents never actually asked how the business was doing. They preferred assumptions. Assumptions were easier. If they asked questions, they might have to admit they were wrong. A month before Dad's retirement dinner, something happened that made me laugh harder than Rachel's text message. My investment group completed a major acquisition. One signature, one meeting, and suddenly the company where my father had worked for 40 years became part of my portfolio. I remember staring at the paperwork afterward. The irony was unbelievable. For years, my father told people he wasn't sure what I did for a living. Now I technically owned the company that signed his paycheck. I never told anyone. Not because it was a secret, because I genuinely didn't care. I had spent years trying to convince my family that I was capable. I was done asking for permission to be respected. Saturday arrived. The retirement dinner was being held in a large banquet hall just outside my hometown. Nearly 80 people were expected. Employees, managers, relatives, friends, people my parents had known for decades. I checked into a small hotel that afternoon and sat on the edge of the bed for a while before getting ready. Part of me didn't want to go. Family events were exhausting. The same conversations, the same judgments, the same reminders that no matter what I accomplished, someone would still see me as the family disappointment. But it was my father's retirement. 40 years at one company deserved respect. So I put on my coat and drove to the banquet hall. The parking lot was already full. Inside, the room looked beautiful. A large banner hung behind the stage. "Congratulations, Richard Bennett, 40 years of service." People were laughing. Music was playing softly. Servers moved between tables. For a moment, it felt like a genuinely happy occasion. Then my mother spotted me. Her smile tightened immediately. "There you are," she said. Her eyes moved over my clothes, checking, judging, measuring, the same way she always had. "At least you dressed appropriately." I smiled politely. "Nice to see you too, Mom." She ignored the comment. "Please don't talk about your business tonight." I almost laughed. What business? The little logistics thing. Little logistics thing. 5 years of work reduced to 3 words. I simply nodded. Arguing never changed anything. Across the room, I spotted my father talking with a group of coworkers. He looked genuinely happy, proud, relaxed. For a moment, I forgot every disagreement we'd ever had, because despite everything, I loved my father, and I wanted him to enjoy his night. I had no idea that within the next hour, the biggest secret in that room was about to become impossible to hide. I found my seat near the back of the hall, not at the family table, not near the stage, near the exit, exactly where I expected to be. That had always been my place in the family, close enough to attend, far enough to be forgotten. A few minutes later, Rachel sat down beside me with a glass of wine. She looked around the room and smiled. "Mom did a good job with this party." "She did," I admitted. Rachel nodded. Then she lowered her voice. "Just try to keep things calm tonight." I laughed. "Why does everyone act like I'm the problem?" She didn't answer immediately, because deep down, she knew I was right. Growing up, Rachel had always been the favorite. Straight A's, college degree, perfect career, perfect life. At least from the outside. I was different. I asked questions, took risks, made decisions nobody understood. And families rarely know what to do with the person who refuses to follow the script. The dinner started shortly afterward. One by one, people stood up to tell stories about my father. Stories about long shifts, snowstorms, broken machinery, 40 years of showing up every day. The room laughed, applauded, celebrated. And honestly, my father deserved every bit of it. Whatever mistakes he had made with me, nobody could deny he worked hard his entire life. As I listened, my phone vibrated. A message from my operations director. A shipment issue in Indiana. Normally, I would have handled it immediately. Instead, I replied with 3 words. "Handle it yourself." A year earlier, that message would have required my attention. Now it didn't, because the company no longer depended entirely on me. That realization made me smile. 5 years ago, I was making deliveries myself. Now I had managers solving problems while I sat at a retirement party. Sometimes growth happens so gradually that you don't notice it until moments like that. Across the room, my mother was introducing herself to everyone she could find, especially the managers, especially the executives. Status mattered to her, always had. She wasn't a bad person, but she cared far too much about what other people thought, and that need for approval had shaped almost every decision she made, including how she treated me. When I started my business, she didn't see ambition. She saw risk. And risk frightened her. Because if I failed, people would talk. That was always her biggest fear. People talking. The applause suddenly stopped. My father had stepped onto the stage. The room immediately grew quiet. He thanked his coworkers, his friends, his supervisors. Then he thanked his family. My mother smiled proudly. Rachel wiped away a small tear. And then Dad said something that caught my attention. "I've been lucky to have people supporting me my whole life." The words weren't cruel, but they stung a little, because I knew he wasn't talking about me. The truth was simple. My father had never really believed in me. Not once. Not when I left college. Not when I bought my first truck. Not when I hired my first employee. Not even when the business became successful. He had already decided who I was, and changing that opinion never seemed important enough to him. The speech ended to loud applause. Then the doors opened. A man in a dark gray suit entered the room. The atmosphere changed immediately. People noticed, managers straightened their posture, employees nodded respectfully. This wasn't just another guest. This was Michael Grant, the plant director, the highest-ranking executive in attendance, the man my mother had been hoping would show up all night. The moment he entered the hall, his eyes landed on me. Recognition flashed across his face. For a second, he looked surprised to see me there. Then he started walking in my direction. I quickly shook my head. Just once. Not yet. Michael understood immediately. He changed direction and headed toward the bar instead. Nobody else noticed, but I did. And something told me the night was about to become very interesting. Because the second my mother spotted him across the room, her entire face lit up. She immediately stood up, straightened her jacket, and began walking toward him. Then she turned around, looking for Rachel, looking for me, and I knew exactly what she was about to do. She was going to introduce her daughters to the most important man in the room. Unfortunately for her, she had no idea who he already knew. "Ava, Rachel, come here." My mother's voice carried across the room. I exchanged a glance with Rachel and stood up. The moment I saw the excitement on Mom's face, I knew exactly what was happening. She wanted to impress Michael Grant. We followed her across the hall. My father joined us halfway there. A few managers and longtime employees drifted closer as well. Within seconds, a small crowd had formed around us. Michael greeted my father first. "Congratulations, Richard. 40 years is an incredible achievement." Dad smiled proudly. "Thank you, sir." My mother practically glowed. This was exactly the moment she had imagined. Then she started introducing her family. "This is our daughter, Rachel," she said proudly. "She's an accountant." Michael shook Rachel's hand. "Nice to meet you." Then my mother turned toward me, and I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. Not because I was nervous, because I knew exactly what was coming. For years, she had introduced me the same way. Different words, same message. The successful daughter and the disappointing one. She placed a hand on my shoulder. "This is Ava." A brief pause, the kind she always used before saying something embarrassing. "She's still trying to figure life out." A few people laughed politely. My mother laughed too. Then she added, "Honestly, she's never been very successful. She always had big ideas, but you know how that goes." The crowd chuckled again. My father looked away. Rachel stared at the floor, and I simply stood there, calm, silent, because I had heard those words before. What happened next was different. Michael didn't laugh. He didn't smile. In fact, he looked genuinely confused. He glanced at me, then back at my mother, then back at me again. The small smile on his face disappeared. The conversation around us started slowing down. People sensed something was off. My mother noticed his expression and rushed to fill the silence. "Oh, don't worry," she said. "We still love her." More awkward laughter. Still nothing from Michael. He slowly set his glass on the table beside him. Then he looked directly at my mother. For the first time all evening, his voice became completely serious. "Mrs. Bennet," he paused. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The laughter stopped immediately. My mother's smile froze. "I'm sorry?" Michael looked at her carefully. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. "I don't think you know who your daughter is." The entire group fell silent, and suddenly every eye in the room was focused on us. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. My mother's smile remained frozen on her face. "I'm sorry," she said nervously. "What do you mean?" Michael looked at me briefly, almost as if asking permission. I gave the smallest nod. "Go ahead." He turned back to my mother. "Mrs. Bennet, Ava isn't struggling to figure life out." The room grew quieter. "Ava is the owner of the investment group that acquired our parent company." Silence. Complete silence. My mother blinked. My father stared. Rachel looked completely lost. I think you've got the wrong person, my mother said quickly. Michael shook his head. No, ma'am, I don't. He pointed toward me. I've attended meetings with Ava for over a year. The color drained from my mother's face. My father looked at me as if he had never seen me before. Michael continued. The company where Richard worked for 40 years is now part of Ava's portfolio. Someone behind us whispered, Wait, she owns the company? Another person repeated it, then another. The whisper spread across the room like a wave. My mother looked horrified. No, that's impossible. I finally spoke. It's true. 3 simple words, but they changed everything. My father swallowed hard. How long? He asked quietly. Almost 5 years since I started the company. His eyes widened. 5 years. 5 years of family dinners. 5 years of jokes. 5 years of being treated like I had failed. And not once had they asked enough questions to learn the truth. Rachel shook her head. Why didn't you tell us? I looked directly at her. For the same reason I stopped explaining myself years ago. She didn't answer, because she already knew. Nobody had wanted to listen. The room remained silent. My mother looked around and realized everyone was watching. Her friends, my father's coworkers, the managers, everyone. The story she had told for years was falling apart in front of all of them, and for the first time in my life, there was no way for her to talk her way out of it. My mother's face turned red. For a moment, I thought she might apologize. Instead, she became angry. You did this on purpose, she said. The room immediately grew tense again. I looked at her calmly. Did what? This. She waved her hand around the room. Humiliate us. Several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. Even Michael looked surprised. I couldn't help but shake my head. Mom, I didn't tell him to say anything. But you knew. Yes. And you let this happen. I took a slow breath. Then I finally said what I had been holding back for years. I let what happen? The truth? That hit harder than anything else. My mother opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because there wasn't really an argument against it. The truth had embarrassed her, not me. My father was still staring at the floor. The proud smile he'd worn all evening was gone. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine. Ava. His voice sounded different, smaller. When did all this happen? I shrugged gently. A little at a time. I told him about the first truck, the first warehouse, the first employees, the first acquisition. Not because I wanted credit, because it was the first time he had ever asked. By the time I finished speaking, my father looked devastated. Not because of my success, because he had missed all of it. Every milestone, every achievement, every struggle. He hadn't been there for any of it. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. Across the room, people had stopped talking completely. Nobody cared about the dinner anymore. Nobody cared about the speeches. They were all watching the Bennett family come apart. Then my father did something I never expected. He stood up, walked over to me, and quietly said, I should have listened. Those 4 words hurt more than every insult that came before them, because I could hear the regret behind them. Real regret. For the first time, my father understood what he had missed. I nodded slowly. Neither of us knew what else to say. The damage of 5 years couldn't be repaired in 5 minutes. But it was a start. And sometimes a start is all you get. A few minutes later, I picked up my coat. I congratulated my father on his retirement, shook Michael's hand, and headed toward the exit. As I reached the door, I looked back one last time. The room was still silent. My mother sat frozen in her chair. My father stood where I had left him. And for the first time in years, nobody in that room was looking at me like a failure. They were looking at me like they finally knew who I was. 3 days later, my assistant called my office. "Ava, there's someone here asking to see you." "Who is it?" She hesitated. "Your father." I sat back in my chair for a moment. Part of me expected this. Another part didn't. "Send him in." A few seconds later, Dad walked into my office. For the first time in my life, he looked uncomfortable around me. Not because of the office, not because of the company, because he didn't know how to start the conversation. He stood there holding his cap in both hands, the same way he used to hold it when he was nervous. Finally, he sat down. "I owe you an apology." I stayed quiet. He looked around the office before speaking again. "You built all of this by yourself?" "Mostly." He slowly nodded. Then he laughed once, a sad laugh. "You know what's funny?" I didn't answer. "I spent years thinking you were making a mistake." He looked down at his hands. "And all that time, you were proving me wrong." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that surprised me. "The worst part isn't that I was wrong," he swallowed. "The worst part is that I never gave you a chance." That one hit me harder than I expected, because it was true. He hadn't hated my dream. He had dismissed it before it even had a chance to succeed. Dad looked up. I missed everything. The first truck, the first warehouse, the first employees, every achievement, every milestone. He shook his head slowly. And that's on me. For the first time since the retirement party, I saw genuine regret, not embarrassment, not guilt about being exposed. Regret, the kind that comes from realizing you can't get lost years back. Finally, I spoke. "You can't change the past, Dad." "I know. But you can decide what happens next." He nodded. A long silence followed. Then he smiled slightly. "Your mother still can't believe it." I laughed. For the first time all week, so did he. The tension in the room finally eased. Before leaving, he stood up and walked toward the door. Then he stopped, turned around, and said the words I had wanted to hear years ago. "I'm proud of you, Ava." I wish I could say that hearing those words fixed everything. It didn't. Some wounds take longer to heal, but it mattered, because this time, he wasn't proud of who I became. He was proud of who I had been all along. The daughter he simply failed to see. As he walked out of my office, I realized something important. Success isn't getting revenge. Success is reaching a point where someone else's opinion no longer decides your worth. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely free. About a month later, I received another call. This time it was from my mother. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered. Neither of us spoke right away. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Your father told me he visited your office." "He did." Another silence. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I handled things badly." It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was the closest she had ever come. For years, my mother had cared more about appearances than reality, what people thought, what people said, what people assumed, and somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing me clearly. "I thought I was protecting you," she said quietly. "From what?" She laughed sadly. "Failure." The irony of that wasn't lost on either of us. For years, she had been so afraid of me failing that she never noticed I had already succeeded. A few weeks later, I attended a family barbecue, the first one since the retirement dinner. Everything felt different. People asked me questions, real questions, about my company, about my life, about the things they had never cared enough to ask before. The strangest part wasn't the attention, it was my mother's silence. For once, she wasn't telling people who I was. She was letting me do it myself. As the evening ended, I watched my parents standing together in the backyard. older than I remembered, more human than I had allowed them to be. And I realized something. The retirement dinner hadn't changed my life. My life had already changed years earlier when I stopped needing their approval. The dinner simply revealed the truth, not to the room, not to my parents, to me. The people who underestimate you can delay your confidence. They can hurt your feelings. They can even make you doubt yourself. But they cannot define you unless you let them. And the moment you stop asking permission to believe in yourself, everything changes.